Good morning, John. Thank you
Good
for
morning,
joining
Kathleen.
us, and thank you all for hanging in till the bitter end. We did save the best for last, you know. So, John, I think it is fascinating that when you look around the country at our 10 largest cities, 20 largest cities actually, the institutions of higher learning there, or academic medical centers, are among the top 10 private employers. Now, here in Philadelphia, it's roughly 50%. Which is really extraordinary. And I'm wondering if that means that we have to redefine the way that we really look at our institutions of higher learning today, that they've really transformed from these quads surrounded by ivory towers to real engines of economic development.
I think that's exactly right. And I guess the first thing I'd say about the phrase ivory tower, it's about the worst possible phrase any college or university could be associated with.
So what do we replace it with?
Well, anchor institution, anchored in the community, for the community's interests, facilitating interactions between the resources, and in particular the people of the universities, the students and faculty, with the needs of the community, and doing that in profound partnership. But the thing about Drexel that I'd like you to know is that Drexel was founded at 32nd and Chestnut Street in 1891, which was literally in the middle of one of the most heavily industrialized zones of the city. We were next to meatpacking plants and manufacturing plants, surrounded by train tracks. And I think that our founder didn't make a casual real estate decision when he put the institute there. He wanted this to be for first-generation kids, women and men, all races and creeds, to have access to an education that they wouldn't normally have access to. Granted, it was a technical education, it wasn't a fancy liberal arts education, but we really take our place seriously, and I think 127 years later, we're at that work full on to try to fulfill his idea of an accessible, affordable, and available institution.
Now, was this a natural evolution? Was this something that universities were going to, a responsibility that would just evolve, or is this deliberate? I'm referring to a very interesting op-ed that you wrote last year, talking about how federal government per capita expenditures in cities has dropped, and so universities in many cases are really stepping up.
Yes.
to make up the difference.
Yeah, I think that's what we feel is not only a sort of a missional obligation, but a moral obligation on our part. Unfortunately, I think many of these other educational institutions circle that in pretty wary ways and are very worried about getting sort of pulled into sort of a quasi-government type of role. I think we've embraced that, frankly, as a way of differentiating our institution and, frankly, bringing more vigor and life to our mission.
So was that op-ed was a call to action then?
It was. I would love to see more of my colleagues in the game. Too often, in all sorts of settings around the city, Drexel's the only university that gets represented in some of these conversations, and all those other institutions have incredible capacity and are, in many cases, doing wonderful work. But I think given the fact that we are of the top 10 cities in the country, we have by far and away the highest poverty rate at 26%. If there's not a call to arms, then that should be the call to arms. And so I think more of our institutions really need to get engaged and get involved. And we have a mission of teaching, research, and service. And service usually is defined in a much more narrow way than it should be. Service to one's own internal community. I'd love for a higher ed to sort of re-examine the notion of service and say, you know what, that should be service to the surrounding communities as well, full-on engagement. And I think that's, in our way, what we're trying to do is wade into that work, do our best with it, and hopefully maybe inspire a few other institutions, to take the journey with us. Well,
give me some specifics. I mean, maybe everyone in the room here and watching already knows what Drexel is doing, but why don't you share with us some of the efforts you've had ongoing and the successes you've had?
Well, I'd say relative to successes, while there are certain things I can point to successes, it's a mission thing, which means you're never done with this work, which means this is a long journey that you have to bring along everyone with it. And I don't think it's necessarily an intuitive thing. So maybe one success I point to is that the conversation about our civic responsibilities and obligations to our community is now a vivid one at this university. I don't think it was a vivid one before. I think it was more of a play defense, town and gown type of thing. And now we're actually defining our strategy around some of these major civic initiatives. We've bet big on the notion of extension, urban extension. We have an urban extension center in the middle of Mantua, which is in the middle of our federal promise zone. And I can go into maybe some of the details of what they do, but we have students and faculty delivering wonderful services to the community in partnership with the community. This is not us with a bunch of solutions running to find the problems.
We are here to rescue you.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. That's the worst way to approach things. And so I think we've bet long on extension. We've bet long on local education. So we have a $30 million federal grant called the Promised Neighborhoods Grant. We support 7 schools, about 5,000 students, K through 8. Through that grant, providing all sorts of enhancements from an educational and support standpoint in these 7 local public schools in the promise. And the last thing we've bet long on is economic development. And so some of our large developments, Schuylkill Yards, U City Square, both of which we're involved in, are designed to be generators of new jobs. And the art of this whole thing, if I'm to sort of sum this up in like one statement, is how do you link a promise zone to an innovation district in authentic ways, as opposed to treat one as one thing over here and one as something else over there. And I'll tell you, this is the hardest work I've ever done, I know my team has ever done. It's easy to say that thing, it's really hard to do it, but at least we're in the middle of trying to do it.
And where are you finding it most difficult? Is it getting the conversation started at your level, within the university and the board and things like that, or is it within the communities, dispelling, I think, what would be natural skepticism?
I think there's a lot of natural skepticism. I think the best way of dealing with skepticism is action, and that means actually doing things where you can show either positive results, or if the results aren't as positive, you learn from them. And so I think the hardest thing for us is trying to build the scaffolding from an education and job training standpoint. So we are, for example, in 25 local child care centers throughout West Philadelphia. We have a cradle-to-career education strategy, and we're building the infrastructure for that. It's incredibly complicated. Dealing with 25 child care centers is incredibly complicated. Serving 5,000 students in 7 local public schools is incredibly complicated, and then we've decided to make it even more incredibly complicated by helping to build a university-assisted, inquiry-based STEM school, which will serve about 800 students in the neighborhood as well.
So is the goal that these students all end up at Drexel, these cradle to grave?
I would love as many of them as possible to come. We have all sorts of scholarship programs and support programs and invitations for them to work with us during the summer. But no, this is really meant to say, look, when you come to this part of West Philadelphia, you can see how the sort of divide between town and gown has been replaced by true partnership between neighborhood and university. And we believe that the key to that are jobs and education, and those two are inextricably linked. And yes, safety is important, and housing is important, and commercial corridors is important, and arts and culture are important as well. But putting the infrastructure in place to build that cradle-to-career pipeline and to make sure that people are job-ready when the jobs come is really the work that we're doing right now. And we'll get graded on the results, as we should be.
Let's talk about Schuylkill Yards, a $3.5 billion, hugely ambitious undertaking, probably, would you say, the most ambitious in the university's 125-year history. What's interesting is you have said it's a statement, it's not just a real estate project, but a statement about who Drexel is.
Yes.
So what's that say?
What Drexel could have done is what most other institutions do, which is you have a huge amount of land and you expand onto the land. And it creates opportunities for the university, and it creates a bigger campus, but it doesn't.
What's wrong with that?
And there's nothing wrong with that. It actually is in your self-interest to do that. It's easier, and you can get to the results more quickly. What we looked at is the economic environment in Philadelphia, both in general, but in particular in West Philadelphia, and said, wouldn't it be better if we actually took that property and did something with it that could also, while supporting the university, be job generating, and then try to link those jobs to the community. By the way, 12% of my employees very happily live in West Philadelphia. And so this is something—
They're looking forward to this.
And they're looking forward to this. And frankly, I would like that 12% to be a much higher percentage. But if the jobs aren't there, then where are we going to go? And so we chose to actually make our campus, at least that part of our campus, an innovation district. done in a Philadelphia way, emphasizing life sciences and information technology, and also making sure we would have residential and retail and open space amenities. So we're, in effect, instead of building an extension of our campus, we're building a neighborhood that one day we hope will employ tens of thousands of people, generate a huge amount of economic activity, and then hopefully a meaningful number of those jobs will be held by people who live in 19104, which is our neighborhood. Now, again, easy to say, super hard to develop and do, but at least we're on it. So as we have this whole Promise Zone strategy activated and we're working on it, we're now seriously linking this to what we're doing with Schuylkill Yards. Our development partner, Brandywine, has put up its first fund to begin to create incentives for local businesses to take part in the development, both construction and provision of goods and services that will happen within Schuylkill Yards. We have all sorts of training programs that are up and running, and we're really trying to specifically link these two things. And it's complicated, and so you find us sort of in mid-stride here.
Well, I think one thing that's complicated, obviously, is if real estate prices go up, as they have in University City. I mean, that's one of the fastest growing parts of the city right now. How are you dealing then with residents who are worried about gentrification? They'll no longer be able to afford their homes in their community.
And that's a profound concern. I think there's a couple of things. First, we've suffered more from the lack of student housing on our campus than anything else, and that has had a long-term and very, very negative impact on our neighborhood. We went from an institution of 7,000 or 8,000 to an institution that's 3+ times that, without building the requisite number of housing. Now, since 2013, we've added 3,000 beds. We're about to add 500 more. We probably need, over time, to add a couple thousand more after that to take down the impact of students living in neighborhoods. We've made a sophomore housing requirement when we used to only have a freshman housing requirement. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We need to get students living on or closer to campus as opposed to out in the neighborhoods. I love my students, but they're not always the best of neighbors because they keep different hours and they do different things, and that isn't always compatible with people who are raising their kids in single-family homes next door. So I think that's one thing. The second thing, though, is that I think we've said, yes, this could happen. This is a possibility, gentrification. So what are we going to do about it? The Extension Center is sort of our frontline strategy. For example, we have a community lawyering clinic there. And so we have my students from the Klein School of Law who are basically working with residents to deal with all sorts of things regarding tangled title and different types of things that threaten them staying in the neighborhood. That is a full-on press. But the problem in the neighborhood right now is more to do with the studentification than the gentrification, but the gentrification is a long-term threat. And so what we need to do is get everyone talking about it because it's a really sensitive and charged subject, and then talk about ways in which we can sort of collectively mitigate that, because we don't want those neighborhoods to change. We want them to be better versions of themselves, but we don't want them to change. We don't want those people to feel at any given time that my neighborhood is no longer my neighborhood. I mean, then why are we doing this?
Exactly.
Like, what's the whole point of a university doing this work if in the end people feel like they're going to be displaced? That cuts to the moral core of what we're trying to do. We want people to feel like they have more opportunity, and they'll have those jobs in Schuylkill Yards, and they'll be able to go to Drexel or Penn. That's really what we're after.
Well, I'd love to go to the audience now. Anyone have any questions? Lady right here.
Hi, John. Terry Gillen. I'm with National LISC, and I know you just became the head of the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, so... No,
I just finished my two-year term, thank God.
Yeah, exactly.
I can never go through that again.
Well, that's my question, is what do you think the city could do to make university leaders and college leaders more integrated into the civic leadership of the city? We see this happening more in other cities, not so much in Philly. And with all the colleges and universities we have here, it just seems like a lot of leadership that's not being integrated into the civic leadership.
How do we get more people to follow your lead?
Yeah, I think that right now within the context of the Chamber, Terry, is we have a College and University President's Leadership Council that was formed a number of years ago. Father Peter Donahue from Villanova chairs that. We probably have 3 or 4 dozen of the local presidents now engaged in that. At every opportunity, we create exchange around some of the issues that we're talking about right here. But you know, I think while the city and the chamber can provide sort of structures to help facilitate those conversations, I actually feel like it's a gut question of institutional mission that leaders have to ask themselves, particularly leaders in America right now, where you know organizations like ours have just become a lot more important. I mean, the new localism, right? I mean, we are the new localism, and so how do we, within the boundaries of resource constraints, how do we extend ourselves in a more significant way? And there are playbooks for how this is done. I used to work for a woman named Judith Rodin at the University of Pennsylvania, and she invented a lot of this stuff. And so there are good playbooks that can be scaled depending on the nature of the institution, small, large, urban, rural. But Terry, I think it's sort of a gut question of mission. And here's the benefit of asking and hopefully answering that question in a positive way. I think the profound benefit that the institution receives in terms of the experience and the formation of its students and faculty and staff, all of us who have the privilege of doing this work, far outweighs anything we would ever spend on this. It's not even close. We are, I would submit to you, a much better institution, not only intellectually but humanistically, because of this work. And again, that's not to say it always goes well every day. I mean, this issue of gentrification, it is a really hard and complicated issue, but I'd rather be confronting this, having gotten in the game and started to play, than saying, well, we can't go near this because that's a charged issue, and if we do anything here, then we're going to risk, you know, our reputation here. So,
another question? Well, then here we have one in the front.
John, Amy Lou at Brookings, it's great to have you with us. You said a couple times in this conversation that you're trying to connect the Innovation District with the promise zones, and that this is really, really hard, but you're glad that you're working on it. I wanted you to elaborate on this. What are the things that make it hard, and what are the things that you are working on to build these connections?
I think I would say number one is schools. So we have a situation in the promise zone where those schools are really challenged. They've been under-resourced. In many cases, they've been under-led, and they haven't been called into a larger strategy. And so, you know, we're working, again, with over 5,000 kids. I'd like to be working with more if we possibly could. The new school we're building will add another 800, you know, to that list, which I think is great. But we're dealing in many cases with the most basic things, just making sure that there are reasonable class sizes and teachers are supported, and that, you know, parents and grandparents and friends are drawn into the conversations, because this is so much more than just what happens in the classroom. And just the work of doing the schools is enormous, because all we are is sort of supplemental. We're not taking that over. Bringing that to the next level of capacity, I think that's sort of number one hard thing. And number two hard thing is that, you know, we have a lot of programs in place for job training, high school equivalency, and, you know, we have something called the Helms Academy in our extension center that's helping people, you know, develop, you know, the right kind of skills to get diplomas. You know, we're serving 100, 200, 300 people. It's like the tip of the iceberg. And so I think the big consuming question for us is, even though we're engaged in all these various activities, there's still not enough scale that we're not touching enough people. And so we do need the city, and we partner wonderfully well with the city. We are really blessed in Mantua in particular to have wonderful civic organizations, Mount Vernon Manor and the PC, and so that's an advantage. But at the end of the day, the need is so much more than our capacity. And so we're just trying to think about ways in which we can accelerate this, bring in other, you know, our local foundations have been terrific, especially Landfest and William Penn have given us enormous resources and support. How do we get more of that? And how do we become a model that might actually inspire other cities as well, maybe by going out and looking at some of the national foundations? But it is just a day-to-day heartbreak knowing that there are so many more kids you can help, and just not necessarily having the resources to get to them. That's our biggest problem.
So, John, we've got 15 seconds left. I know you've said your goal is to create the most civically engaged university in the country. Mm-hmm. Are you there yet?
No, we're not, but we're trying, and we want others to compete with us. So higher ed being a very...
challenge has been laid down.
Higher ed being a competitive industry, I figured I'd throw that out there. Maybe some others will get in the race with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Pleasure.
And thank you all.